The following is an audio presentation of The Haunted House Killer, read to you by its author, James Griffin. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, attributed to Edmund Burke, renowned statesman and philosopher. Chapter 1. The past doesn't always stay in the past. Flashes of distant memories consume the young man's mind, visions of a smiling boy of around 14 being not only accepted but befriended by a group of older boys around the age of 17. They're all laughing and talking as they walk down the street, passing by young trick-or-treaters who, under the watchful eye of their parents, scramble to obtain treats from well-lit houses lining the block. The boys arrive at an old barn that is being used as a type of makeshift haunted house for Halloween. As they stand outside waiting to buy their tickets, they seem oddly anxious, laughing nervously, perhaps trying to act cool in the face of their fears. Once they enter the haunted house, the onslaught starts almost immediately, with doors and side panels opening as costumed characters jump out at them screaming. The sound that surrounds them is deafening, and all the boys seem to love it. They see ghouls and goblins of all shapes and sizes, movie monsters and killers coming from every corner. But then, about a third of the way through, the older boys suddenly divert, leading the younger boy away from the crowd. "Where are we going?" the younger boy asks nervously. "Just follow us," one of the older boys calls back, barely audible over the riotous noise. The leader of the older boys opens a door to what seems like an old tack room. As soon as the boys enter, one of them, not the younger, remains slightly in the rear of the group and slams the door shut, as the other two older boys set upon the younger, punching and striking him without mercy. The younger boy is in a state of confusion, his lip bleeding, his eyes swelling. He's knocked to the floor, and one of the older boys kicks him in his midsection, quite possibly breaking one of his ribs. It is then that a back door opens, and a man dressed as a demonic clown walks into the room and approaches the leader of the older boys with a huge smile on his face. The clown hands the leader of the boys a $100 bill, and the boy smiles and sticks the bill into his pocket, as the other two older boys stand the younger boy to his feet, undressing him to the clown's delight. Though the events that preceded this, the supposed friendship and the beating, were based on the young boy's actual memories, the assault by the clown has been mashed from the boy's mind, replaced by the screams of devils and visions of the demonic clown's face. Yet the pain and anguish that the boy endures based on these things are even more real to him than the physical beating that he took. The back door to the tack room opens again, the very door that the clown had come through, and another costumed character walks in. It's quite apparent that this new visitor is taken aback by what he sees, as he screams at the boy's attackers, "What are you doing?" He then runs up, punching the pedophilic clown just as the clown spins around to face him, catching him solidly on the jaw, knocking him to the ground. The older boys run from the area as the younger boy collapses, apparently dazed and weakened from the attack. Chapter 2. Government Cutbacks. This day is like any other. Andrew Reed, a patient at the Lakeview Mental Health Facility, sits at a table engaged in a spirited conversation with a friend that is not really there. Melissa Haley, another patient in the same day room, is taking part in a dance recital that may or may not have actually taken place when she was a little girl. And Donnie Adams, a third patient at the facility, sits in his room, alone and silent as usual, with a faraway look in his eye, lost somewhere in his past. Dr. Dylan Kirkman, chief medical consultant at the Lakeview facility, accompanied by registered nurse Courtney Rudloff, are making their daily rounds. "You know, Courtney, this place is going to be so different," Dr. Kirkman says with a tone of concern, "not to mention the lives of so many of our patients. Government cutbacks are forcing many of the residents of mental health facilities across the state into the streets, and sadly these cuts are slated to begin in Auburn County, where Lakeview is located, tomorrow. The government only cares if a person is hazardous to the safety of the general public," Dr. Kirkman says, shaking his head. "If they aren't, then the government sees no need to pay for their care or hospitalization." "So what actually happens tomorrow?" Courtney asks. "I mean, surely we aren't just throwing the doors open and abandoning them." "No," Dr. Kirkman says, shaking his head. "It's not as bad as all that. The social worker for the county health department will be coming in tomorrow, interviewing each of our patients, and will then make their recommendations. Once a determination is made, social workers will then escort them to a local homeless shelter. They will still have limited counseling sessions and assistance, but for the most part, these men and women will be more on their own than they have ever been before. It just breaks my heart, as I really thought I'd be able to get through to some of them, especially Donnie. I know that he's still in there. He's been through enough difficulty in his life, and he doesn't need this on top of everything else. This is his home, and we're his family. The next day, social worker Mary Kane walks into the main lobby of the Lakeview facility and approaches the security desk. "I'm here to see Dr. Kirkman," she says abruptly. "Yes, ma'am," the orderly says dismissively, barely looking up. Then, keying a button at his desk, he calls out over the intercom, "Dr. Kirkman, please report to the lobby. Dr. Kirkman, please report to the lobby." As soon as the message is delivered, the orderly goes back to his paperwork, not acknowledging Mary any further. With a breath of agitation, Mary steps away from the security desk, glaring at a door that leads to the patient areas. Within a few moments, a loud buzzer sounds, unlocking the door, and Dr. Kirkman and Nurse Courtney enter the lobby where Mary is waiting. "Good morning, Miss Kane," Dr. Kirkman says with a smile. "This is Nurse Courtney." "Yeah, you can scrap the pleasantries," Mary says, interrupting Dr. Kirkman. "Can we just get started?" she says abruptly. "Okay," Dr. Kirkman says rather uncomfortably. "So I guess today is the day," he says, again trying to lighten the mood. "You mean the day that your problems become my problems?" Mary says abruptly. "How many patients are currently in this facility, Dr. Kirkman?" Mary asks rather brashly. "Well," Dr. Kirkman begins to respond, still taken aback by the social worker's demeanor. "We currently have 46 patients, 17 of which have been long-term residents." "Well, we'll be focusing on your long-term residents and see how many of them we can get out of here." Dr. Kirkman shakes his head disbelievingly, motioning for the orderly to buzz them back into the patient areas. As the trio walks down the corridor, Mary never looks up from her clipboard. They go in and out of patient rooms, and she simply asks each patient a uniform set of questions, never acknowledging them in the slightest, instead treating them like an assembly line project. Finally, Dr. Kirkman can't keep silent any longer. "You know, our patients are people," he says directly, "and they deserve a little courtesy and respect." Mary glares at Dr. Kirkman with a hostility he wasn't expecting. "Look, Kirkman, maybe you're a bleeding heart, but I'm not. I'm not looking to build a relationship with these people or with you. I have friends, so what you see as people, I see as numbers, and that's how they will be treated." Dr. Kirkman takes a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "I'm just trying to say that we teach our patients their significance and importance, not only to us, but to the God that created them. And this knowledge comforts them, especially during times of turmoil such as this." It's now Mary that breathes heavily, shaking her head violently. "This is a county facility, Kirkman. God has no business here, and I'm starting to think you don't either." A now angered Dr. Kirkman swallows his words, refusing to argue any further. The Bible says to not cast your pearls before swine, and right now that is exactly how this boisterous social worker is behaving. Mary continues down the hallway, finally reaching Donnie Adams' room, where he is standing in an almost catatonic state. His eyes blink from time to time, but he seems oblivious to their presence. Mary begins running through her small narrative, explaining who she is and why she is there, and then begins to run through her questions. Donnie gives no responses, just standing there staring off blankly, seeing what's happening in his mind rather than what's happening in his room. "Well, I guess I'm done," Mary says with a smile. "The county will be receiving my recommendations, and you'll be notified of which patients are being released. The entire process shouldn't take more than a few days." "Wait, so how did you evaluate Donnie?" Dr. Kirkman asks. "You mean patient Adams?" Mary says sharply. "Simple, he's been in this facility for 8 years. According to his file, he has never shown any aggression toward anyone. Even today, he seemed oblivious to his surroundings. Based on that, I would have to ask you, Dr. Kirkman, what's the difference between him sitting here or sitting somewhere else? We ensure that he eats and at least experiences human interaction. I don't see that as the county's responsibility." With that being said, Mary turns and walks out of the room, making a beeline back down the main corridor. Then, being buzzed out, she exits the facility. "Do you believe that woman?" Courtney asks. "No, I don't. But sadly, the county will," Dr. Kirkman responds. Sure enough, within 2 days, Mary returns to the Lakeview facility with custody orders in hand and several deputy sheriffs in tow. "Well, Dr. Kirkman, I've got good news for you. The county has approved the release of all 17 of your long-term residents." "I don't consider that good news," Dr. Kirkman says quietly, slightly under his breath. Well, the county does, Mary says in a haphazard tone. She then begins going into patients' rooms one at a time, rushing them out into the hands of waiting deputies. Why are our patients being treated like criminals? Courtney asks angrily. The county sheriff's office handles all mental health transports, Mary says abruptly, and they are no longer your patients. They are, however, still county mental health patients. Now, why don't you make yourself useful, Mary says to Courtney dismissively. If these people have any personal effects, box them up and contact their families to come and get them. Many of our patients don't have families. Can't they just take their stuff with them? No, Mary says flatly, then goes into the next room, ushering out the next patient to the next deputy. Before long, Dr. Kirkman and Nurse Courtney find themselves standing alone in a now deserted wing of their facility, their heads bowed in prayer for their now former patients, papers and patient property strewn everywhere, the apparent aftermath of Tornado Mary. Chapter 3. Mary Strikes Again. The first few weeks come and go, with not only social workers inundating the shelter, following up with each of the now released mental health patients, but Dr. Kirkman, even though he is no longer assigned to administer their care, is also stopping by and checking in on them. He tries to explain to the shelter staff about the special care that some of the patients need, but each of them refuses to help him. We're just here to prevent trouble, one staff member says to the good doctor. Other than that, they're on their own. With this, Dr. Kirkman sets out to be a one-man hospital staff, running to and fro, trying to ensure that each of his former patients is cared for. But one day, as Dr. Kirkman is feeding his former patient, Donnie Adams, he hears a shrill voice cry out, "What are you doing here?" It's Mary Kane, the lead county social worker who has just walked into the room. "I'm ensuring that Donnie, as well as many of the others, are being cared for," Dr. Kirkman says confidently. "Well, that isn't your job anymore, Doctor. They have been released from your custody and they can care for themselves." "But they can't," Dr. Kirkman attempts to explain. "Look at Donnie. He isn't even aware that there's food in this room. So how is he supposed to eat it?" Mary openly giggles and says, "He isn't even aware there's a room, much less that there's food in it. But none of that matters. This is no longer your job, if it ever was. I do hope that you're not billing the county for the time that you are spending here." "Of course I'm not. When I'm here, I'm working for God. For his word says, when you do it unto the least of these, you do it also unto me." "OMG," Mary exclaims. "More of that God nonsense. This ends here and now. These are no longer your patients. So starting tonight, you have no business here." "That isn't your call to make," Dr. Kirkman interjects. "No, but it is hers," Mary says, pointing at another woman who has just entered the room. "May I introduce you to Miss Jenny Yates, the administrator of this shelter?" "What seems to be the problem?" Miss Yates asks. "There is no problem," Dr. Kirkman responds. "Well, as a representative of the county, I strongly disagree," Mary interjects. "Dr. Kirkman is providing care and treatment for those that are no longer under his authority, and as a county-supported shelter, I must insist that he not be permitted to interact with those in our custody." Miss Yates is appalled. "I am so sorry, Miss Kane. I thought that he was one of your social workers." "Well, he isn't," Miss Kane says, glaring at Dr. Kirkman. Dr. Kirkman turns to address Mary. "This isn't necessary. I'm only here to ensure that these people have a life that's worth living." "Their lives are no longer your concern," Mary says pointedly. "I'm sorry, Dr. Kirkman. I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Miss Yates says rudely. "Fine," Dr. Kirkman says angrily, as he turns and apologizes to Donnie, who is still oblivious to his surroundings. "If you come back here, I'll have you arrested for trespassing," Miss Yates adds, speaking to Dr. Kirkman. Dr. Kirkman glances in her direction and shakes his head in disbelief, then walks to the door and exits the building. Chapter 4. The Ghostly Gallows. With Dr. Kirkman now blocked from providing care, a few of his former patients end up hospitalized for malnutrition. Yet, based on hospital guidelines, they are simply stabilized and then turned back out on the streets, just to repeat the process over and over again. And those are the lucky ones. Other former patients, such as Donnie Adams, now in the hands of an uncaring system, find themselves lost and alone on the streets after being released from the hospital, wandering about trying to make a connection with their surroundings. It's then that a young man wearing a black hood overlaid with a skeletal face, a pair of black gloves with skeletal hands, and a hospital gown, finds himself standing there watching as a maintenance man works on a power outlet at the old Auburn County Jail. The site has not housed prisoners for over 80 years, but has, with its ancient-looking gallows and old-world construction, become quite popular as a haunted house attraction on Halloween. The maintenance worker, David Shaw, glances up at his observer and chuckles under his breath. "We aren't open yet, son. Come back tonight at around 8, David says politely. His costumed observer seems oblivious to his words, or to the 70s rock that is blaring from David's old cassette player. "Did you hear me, son?" David questions sharply. The young man then walks over to David's open toolbox, which is seated on a table just a few feet away from him. "Get out of there," David yells angrily, now climbing to his feet, walking over to the oddly costumed intruder. David spins the young man around to face him, but as he does, the young man plunges a 10-inch flathead screwdriver that he has taken from the toolbox into David's chest. David stands there, a look of shock on his face, as the costumed figure goes into a frenzy, stabbing him repeatedly as his lifeless body falls to the ground. Sitting in front of his television, Dr. Kirkman hears the news report of the nude body of a maintenance worker, David Shaw, being discovered at the Ghostly Gallows haunted house. "That's odd," Dr. Kirkman thinks to himself. "I wonder why he was naked." At about that time, there's a knock on Dr. Kirkman's front door. As he answers, young police detective Eric Hill of the Auburn County Sheriff's Office displays his identification. "Dr. Kirkman, I was wondering if I could have a word with you about one of your former patients." "Well, it depends," Dr. Kirkman responds. "I mean, you know I'm bound by doctor-patient confidentiality, but I'll do what I can." "According to county records, you treated a patient by the name of Donnie Adams. Is that correct?" Detective Hill asks. "As you stated, you have the records, so yes. Why?" "Well, Mr. Adams' whereabouts are currently unknown, and it's my understanding that he was physically assaulted at a haunted house attraction when he was young. Do you believe that your former patient could have been involved in the murder at Ghostly Gallows this evening?" "What do you mean, Donnie's whereabouts are unknown?" Dr. Kirkman asks demandingly. "I mean exactly what I said," Detective Hill says, point blank. "He was taken from the homeless shelter, and he was hospitalized, and upon his release, he disappeared. Now I ask you again, do you feel that he could have been involved in the murder at Ghostly Gallows today?" "No," Dr. Kirkman responds distractedly. "Donnie has no connection to the real world or to those in it. Where his mind is truly at, we've never been able to figure that out." "So where do you think he might be? I mean physically," Detective Hill asks. "I have no idea. His parents were killed in a car accident shortly after he was hospitalized. That's how he became a long-term resident at our facility, until the county tossed him out on the street. I don't know where else he could have gone to." "Okay, thank you for your time, Doctor. If you think of anything that could be helpful, please give me a call," Detective Hill says as he hands Dr. Kirkman his card. Dr. Kirkman leaves his home right behind Detective Hill. Jumping into his car, he begins an unfruitful search for his former patient. The next night, Dr. Kirkman prepares to leave for work, but as he opens his front door, he receives quite a shock, for standing there, rocking back and forth, is his former patient, Donnie Adams. "What in the world?" Dr. Kirkman says as he looks up and down his street, wondering how Donnie had found his way here. "Please, Donnie, come in," Dr. Kirkman says, pulling him into his home. Taking Donnie to a guest room, he helps him change from his mud-covered hospital gown into some flannel pajamas. "Well, at least you'll be warmer in this," Dr. Kirkman says, smiling at Donnie. "How did you find my home?" Dr. Kirkman wonders aloud, for the first time thinking that perhaps Donnie is not as oblivious as everyone thinks he is. Once he is changed and clean, Dr. Kirkman feeds Donnie, glancing at the phone multiple times, wondering if he should call the police. But to do so would make it seem as if he believes in Donnie's guilt, and nothing could be further from the truth. Or could it? Suddenly the phone rings, and Dr. Kirkman, startled, answers it. "Hello?" "Hi, Dr. Kirkman," Courtney says, cheerily. "I was just checking on you. Is everything okay?" "Oh, I'm sorry, Courtney," Dr. Kirkman responds, glancing at his watch. "Yeah, I'm fine. I just got caught up in something. I'll be at the hospital in just a few minutes." Dr. Kirkman then hangs up and looks at his new house guest. "I guess you'll be all right here," Dr. Kirkman says to Donnie, quietly, trying to reassure himself more than anything else. Chapter 5. The Haunted Hayride. One of the most exciting events in Auburn County is the annual Halloween Hayride, or the Haunted Hayride, as it's more commonly known, which is essentially just what it sounds like. Groups of people take turns getting into an old hay wagon that is being pulled by a small team of plow mules, and they take a trip through one of the densest and most foreboding wooded areas in the county. Randy Davis, now in his mid-20s, has been coming to the haunted hayride ever since he was a kid, but this year was different, as this year he had a date, so there's no way that he's going to miss it. He and Catherine Johns, a young woman from the community, have been seeing each other for the last several months, but despite his excitement, they still arrived late, as it had already been one of those days where everything seemed to be going badly, so they end up having to wait in line trying to act calm in front of one another, but inwardly their fear and excitement are already beginning to build. Catherine had never come to the haunted hayride before, as she wasn't particularly fond of being afraid, but Randy was so excited, so she thought she'd give it a try. Finally, they, along with 8 other thrill-seekers, take their seats inside the wagon, and off they go. Upon entering the tree line, the darkness is thicker than it originally appeared. The sound of silence is almost deafening. But then there's a shrill scream, and a blood-covered simpleton dressed in torn overalls climbs out from under the wagon, swinging an axe wildly. "He must have been with us since we boarded the wagon," Randy shouts to Catherine, laughing. Suddenly, an onslaught of masked characters come from every direction, screams echoing through the woods. All the riders on the wagon are screaming and shouting, some even laughing, when suddenly a masked character, his deformed face covered by what appears to be a piece of burlap cloth, jumps up and into the wagon, wielding a makeshift chainsaw, revving it threateningly at the terrified spectators. Then, as everyone is distracted, another hooded character, this one wearing a pair of blood-covered work coveralls with the name Dave printed over his upper pocket, comes up behind Randy and grabs him, pulling him back as Catherine screams wildly. Others on the wagon are laughing hysterically until the skull-faced hooded man in coveralls plunges a 10-inch screwdriver into Randy's chest. As his blood begins to spill, Catherine, Randy's girlfriend, begins to scream. The hooded figure jumps into the wagon, stabbing Catherine in the throat, silencing her as she falls to the wagon floor. The man that is wielding the chainsaw then directs his attention to his new assailant, looking at him rather confusedly until he feels the large screwdriver that had just taken the lives of Randy and Catherine jab into his stomach. His attacker lunging into him, knocking him from the wagon, both men landing with a loud thud on the ground. The costumed character that had been playing the role of a chainsaw-wielding psychopath is now laying on the ground in a pool of blood, as his murderer continues with his forward momentum, doing a controlled roll off of his body and then gaining his footing, runs into the woods, leaving 3 bodies in his wake. At first, others in the wagon continue laughing and yelling, having the time of their lives, with no idea that what they just witnessed was not just a part of the show. But as the victims lay there, with no signs of life, and the costumed workers at the hayride begin running and screaming for the police, shouting on cell phones, the other riders realize that something is very wrong. Dr. Kirkman, sitting in the break room at the hospital, distracted by thoughts of his new unattended house guest, suddenly hears a news broadcast that catches his attention. He hears the reporters say that 3 people have been killed at the haunted hayride, and his blood runs cold. "Courtney," he shouts, "I have to go. Please cover for me." With no further explanation, Dr. Kirkman runs from the room in the hospital. Jumping into his car, he fires up the engine and hits the main street, squalling his tires and driving recklessly. "Dear God, please watch over me tonight. Watch over and protect Donnie, Lord. I know that he's in there, and I know that you can reach him. Also, be with those that lost their lives tonight, Lord, and be with the police officers that are investigating this horrible crime." As he arrives at his home, Dr. Kirkman runs from his car and finds a large track of muddy boot prints on his front porch. Opening the front door, Kirkman calls out, "Donnie, where are you?" As Dr. Kirkman enters the guest room that he'd left Donnie in earlier in the day, he sees Donnie appearing as oblivious as usual, just rocking back and forth. Dr. Kirkman looks around the room and notices there's a good deal of mud in the carpet, and just under the bed that Donnie is seated on, there's a pair of mud-covered boots. "Donnie, what did you do tonight?" Dr. Kirkman screams his former patient. Donnie doesn't respond. He just sits there blankly. At this time, Dr. Kirkman hears the front doorbell ring. So filled with frustration and anxiety, he goes to the front door. "Who is it?" Dr. Kirkman asks harshly. "It's Detective Eric Hill, Dr. Kirkman. I need to speak with you." Dr. Kirkman stands there, looking at the door and then back toward Donnie's room, wondering what he should do. Finally taking a deep breath, he opens the door. Detective Hill asks, "I haven't caught you at a bad time, have I?" "No, not at all," Dr. Kirkman responds. "Okay, it just seemed to take you a while to open your door," Officer Hill says suspiciously. With no response from Dr. Kirkman, Detective Hill continues. "I suppose you heard that your boy struck again," Detective Hill says angrily. "We need to stop him, and I mean now. If you're hiding any information from me on this, so help me, you'll wish that you had been one of his victims." "I'm not hiding anything from you," Dr. Kirkman says, shaking, as he glances towards the door of the bedroom that he knows Donnie is in. Detective Hill, noticing Dr. Kirkman's distraction, glances at the bedroom door and gives a crooked smile as he looks back to Dr. Kirkman. "Have you been home all night, Dr. Kirkman?" Detective Hill asks. "No, I was at the hospital for a few hours, but then I started to not feel so good, so I came home," Dr. Kirkman says flatly. Detective Hill glares at Dr. Kirkman for a few minutes and then finally says, "All right, please give me a call if you think of anything that could help. This has to end." "I will," Dr. Kirkman responds, walking Detective Hill to the front door and seeing him out. Dr. Kirkman then takes a seat in his living room, silently praying for God's guidance. "I can't just give Donnie over to them, Lord. He would be railroaded. His guilt or innocence wouldn't matter." He then breathes deeply, sitting there in his chair with his eyes focused on the guest room. Chapter 6. Halloween at the Hospital. After a very sleepless night, Dr. Kirkman goes to check on Donnie. "Well, Donnie, today is Halloween. If you're going to do anything, tonight will be the night." Donnie just sits there, not even glancing in the good doctor's direction. Dr. Kirkman goes out to his garage and retrieves an old bike chain. Then going back in the house, he fastens it to Donnie's right leg and the bottom bedpost. "Well, that was easier than I thought it would be," Dr. Kirkman says, stepping back, looking at Donnie, who is still sitting there, rocking back and forth. Dr. Kirkman, now convinced that if Donnie was involved in the killings, he at least wouldn't be able to do anything tonight, heads off to work. Upon his arrival, the facility is dark, and Courtney meets him by the main entrance security door with a flashlight, manually keying him through the security door. "What's going on, Courtney?" "We've lost power for some reason. All the security doors have to be operated manually, and lights everywhere are out. I've already alerted maintenance, who are checking on it, but I haven't heard anything back from them yet." "Okay," Dr. Kirkman says uneasily. "Give me a light and a main key. I'm going to go down to the generator room and see if I can help." Courtney hands the doctor a flashlight and the main key. "Be careful, doctor," she says with an awkward smile. "I will. Thank you. Please ensure that all of our patients are okay. They have to be shook up." We've gathered them all in the main room, with 2 CNAs equipped with battery-operated lanterns. Luckily, we only have 14 transitional patients in tonight, so some of them will be out of here in a few days, and thus far we have no new admissions, Courtney responds. "Great job," Dr. Kirkman calls back to her as he hurries down the darkened corridor. Using his passkey, Dr. Kirkman opens the stairwell and begins his descent into the lower floors of the hospital. As he approaches the generator room, he sees Steve, the facility maintenance man, lying on the floor in a pool of blood. As he approaches, he hears someone in the same general area, and he shines his flashlight in the direction of the noise and catches sight of a hooded figure with the outline of a skull painted on it, wearing coveralls. "Donnie!" Dr. Kirkman screams as the figure runs away. Dr. Kirkman goes back to the problem at hand. Looking at the circuit breaker box, he sees the flip breaker and restores the power. He then checks on Steve, and sadly, there is no pulse. Dr. Kirkman runs to an intercom, which was restored with the power, and pushes the button. "This is Dr. Kirkman. Get the police here at once. Steve has been murdered. And get me out of here. I have to go and check on something." The orderly assigned to work security picks up his radio, alerting Courtney, then calling 911. He gets the police on the phone and then proceeds to buzz each security door until he gets Dr. Kirkman out of the building. Jumping into his car, Dr. Kirkman drives like a madman, racing with the devil himself, praying as fast as he is driving. Arriving at his home, Dr. Kirkman bursts into the door. Running back to his guest room, he sees Donnie, still seated on the bed, rocking back and forth as before. But the bike chain that he'd put on him earlier has been removed. "Donnie, please tell me that wasn't you." But as the words leave his mouth, he sees the blood-covered screwdriver, the muddy boots, and the blood-stained coveralls lying on the floor. Detective Hill, finding the front door ajar, comes in with his gun drawn. "Dr. Kirkman," he calls out. "Yeah, I'm back here," Dr. Kirkman calls back. As Detective Hill enters the room, he sees Donnie Adams seated on the bed and the murderer's costume and weapons on the floor. "So you've known where he was all along, huh, Doctor?" Detective Hill says in a smug voice. "Why didn't you turn him in? This didn't have to go this far." "I didn't think he was guilty," Dr. Kirkman says with his head down. "Well, what do you think now? Is he the killer, Dr. Kirkman? Or is there someone beyond this mindless dolt that has been playing you?" "What?" Dr. Kirkman says confusedly. "Maybe someone else committed the first murder and then dropped him off on your front porch. Then maybe that same someone came and muddied up your porch and even left a good set of boots, though dirty, under his bed. And then maybe that same someone killed again tonight and cut the bike chain off of Donnie here with a pair of bolt cutters." As Detective Hill speaks, he lays his gun down, picking up the large screwdriver, and walks towards the now silent Dr. Kirkman. "See, maybe Donnie here was not the only young person that was affected by the attack that he underwent at that haunted house so long ago. Maybe one of his attackers watched and enjoyed the power that it brought him." "Police officers don't become murderers," Dr. Kirkman says questioningly. "No, but murderers do become police officers," Detective Hill says with a smile. Suddenly the memories in Tony's mind become more vivid. He again sees his demonic attacker handing the oldest boy the $100 bill, and he hears him say, "Thanks, Eric." And Donnie sees the young smiling face of Eric Hill. For the first time since that day, Donnie becomes aware of what is happening around him. He's no longer looking into his past. Now he's staring directly at Detective Hill, who is so busy terrorizing Dr. Kirkman that he isn't even aware of Donnie's change in demeanor. Donnie suddenly leaps from his seated position on the bed, catching Detective Hill, who is now wielding the screwdriver, by surprise. Both men fall to the floor, struggling for control over the screwdriver. Detective Hill, finally gaining the upper hand, lifts the screwdriver, preparing to plunge it into Donnie's chest when the sound of gunshots rings out, and Detective Hill falls backwards, dead. Detective Hill had become so focused on killing with the screwdriver that he forgot about the sidearm that he had entered the house with. Dr. Kirkman, however, remembered it, and he grabbed it as soon as he saw the opportunity, and for Donnie it was just in time. Dr. Kirkman kneels by Donnie's side, crying and praying as his young patient lays there, breathing heavily. Donnie's eyes are no longer focused on his past. They are now here in the present and focused on his doctor, the man that didn't give up on him, no matter how bad things looked. 1 John 2:14. "I have written unto you, fathers, because you have known him that is from the beginning. I have written unto you, young men, because you are strong, and the word of God abideth in you, and you have overcome the wicked one."